Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Right, has everybody got a handout for today's lecture? There by the door, there. Voicing and aspiration. These are very basic matters in phonetic description. Some of you may be very familiar with them already. Others of you may not. The basic theory is set out in point 1 on the handout. Voicing depends on the vocal folds, or vocal cords as they're also known, which are in the larynx. Now you can feel your larynx if you put your hand on your throat and feel where there is a hard projection there. It's the Adam's apple, as it's sometimes known. That's the cartilage that protects the vocal folds which lie inside. Now, the word fold is a bit more accurate than cords, but most of all they're like lips. They're like a pair of lips set across the pipe, trachea, that brings the air up from the lungs. And they lie across like that. They can open, they can close, they can do various other things. We've got lips here in a different orientation than proper lips of the mouth. The vocal folds are like lips lying across from front to back. The space between them is important. We refer to this space as the glottis. The glottis, the space between the vocal folds, and the adjective glottal refers to the glottis. So glottal means to do with the vocal folds, to do with the space between the vocal folds. The glottis can adopt various configurations, various arrangements. First of all, the glottis can be open. That means the vocal folds are apart. That means the air can pass between them. When you breathe in and out, whether through your mouth or through your nose, the vocal folds are apart to allow the air to go through. If you make a speech sound with this configuration, the result is voiceless. So an example would be the speech sound S. Now the air passes freely through the glottis. There's an obstruction in the mouth, but there's nothing happening really at the glottis, a voiceless sound. If, on the other hand, the vocal folds are closed, don't sit there, that's for the handouts, so if you don't mind, take a handout, newcomers, and find the seats on the Alright, if the vocal folds then adopt the second configuration, being closed, that means they come together, they're held together, they prevent the air flowing. The air is held back in the lungs, plus trachea and so on, can't get up into the mouth or into the nose. This means the glottis then is closed. We have what we refer to as a glottal stop, a glottal plosive. And this is, like all voices plosives, impossible to hear until you release it. If I alternate between a glottal stop and a vowel, that's a symbol for glottal stop, you get this. And the up moment between the vowels, that is with the glottis closed, cutting off the air. Just try and do that, everybody. Okay, good. Now, this speech sound, because it is a sound, even though you can't hear it, is playing an increasingly important role in English. It basically has two functions in English: to reinforce other sounds or to replace other sounds. It often reinforces initial vowel. And it can reinforce also various voiceless consonants in certain positions, notably the closest particular. It replaces T in certain environments. That is, it replaces the normal alveolar articulation. We should look at these things over the various lectures that we have to deal with these topics, but I just mention it now in brief. Let's just look at this matter of reinforcing an initial vowel. If we take an English word like eat, this begins with a vowel sound. Talking about sounds, not letters, of course. Eat. Now, if we say this word in isolation, if we've been breathing beforehand, the vocal folds have been open. For the vowel, they're going to have to move to the fourth position of vibrating. We shall come to that in a minute. But they don't necessarily move there directly, eat. What people often do is reinforce this with a glottal stop like this, eat. Eat. You can hear this more clearly if I put it within a sequence of sounds in connected speech. What I'm going to do is eat, nothing there. What I'm going to do is eat. There's the glottal stop. What I'm going to do is eat. What I'm going to do is eat. In English, this is a kind of emphasis, sometimes called hard attack. We do it when we want to emphasize the word, when we say it's absolutely everything you've got to pay attention to. 2 points to make about this. First of all, in some languages, notably German, but also some others, all initial vowels have this hard attack, this glottal stop. This sounds bad in English if you do it with all the words beginning with a vowel. So speakers of German and similar languages have to cut down on these glottal stops. Other people who maybe don't use it at all might like to note this possibility of emphasis that comes through it and use it within moderation. It has actually given rise to a bit of debate recently because it seems to be on the increase in English, to be on the increase rather than to be on the increase, and it has consequences for weak forms. Again, we'll come to this later on, but let's note that in a phrase like to eat, the traditional pronunciation, to eat, because we've got a vowel here, gets the weak form to, or the hardly weakened form to before it. To eat, to eat, to eat. Whereas people who use the glottal stop version, to eat, the glottal stop seems to function as a consonant in triggering the preconsonantal form of the weak form. So you get to eat, to eat. And that's what people tend to write and complain about when radio announcers, newsreaders, use that pronunciation. People write in and say how ugly it is. Well, ugly or not, it's clearly on the increase because we seem to be drifting from the traditional to eat gradually towards to eat. That's just a bit of extra for those of you who know all about the rest of this already and might be getting bored. Let's go back to the configurations of the glottal opening. We see that the glottis can be open, air flows freely, closed, air can be blocked. Third possibility, the glottis might be narrowed. Sorry about this noise. We can't win, can we? We move from one lecture theatre to another, hoping to avoid it, and we still find it. Okay, the glottis can be narrowed. This means the two lips come close together, but don't actually touch. That's the result. We get whisper. Just try doing that whisper, everybody. Can you feel some amount of tension there because they're narrowed? Contrast wide open and narrowed. Now the point about this narrowing is it makes the air a bit turbulent, and creating some kind of noise depends upon making turbulence in the air, making it churn around. Fourth possibility is that the vocal folds vibrate. Now this means that they open and close rapidly. This gives us voice. When I go, ah, that's the vocal folds vibrating. Ah, so that's the fourth possibility. And of course, we use this in all languages a very great deal. It's the basis of making speech audible, because the other configurations of the glottis don't give rise to easily heard sounds. Vibrating vocal folds then. The resultant speech sound is voiced, and we refer to the sound as being voiced because it's got voice, that is to say, this vibrating of the vocal folds. Now, how can you tell whether a sound is voiced or not? If it's you doing the speaking yourself, look at point 2 on the handout, some ways to detect voicing. You can feel your throat with your hand. Put your thumb and forefinger there. Everybody do this and do it aloud. Don't whisper it to yourself and go, ah. Can you feel that? Ah, ah, ah. You can feel the vibration there with your thumb and forefinger. Ah. Well now, if we compare voiceless and voiced sounds, we might be able to get the same effect. Depending on which are easier, you could try any of these pairs of voiceless and voiced sounds and switch backwards and forwards like this. All right. That's one way then to detect it. You can even do that with someone else's throat if they are. The next one you can't do with somebody else's, it's got to be your own. And this is if you cover your ears and then listen. Now, again, please do it aloud. Don't try and do it softly. Make a lot of noise and do the same thing. All right. Can you all hear that great noise that fills your head for the voiced one, but not for the voiceless one? It's also possible to use scientific apparatus of various kinds to make these measurements, much more precisely, of course, the speech spectrograph, the laryngograph, and other equipment available in the phonetics laboratory. When is it on? On Thursday this week, Dr. Abberton will be showing you how this can be done with the laryngograph, which he'll be demonstrating to you on Thursday afternoon. Well, you can now experiment with the sound as in mother, and decide if it's voiceless or voiced. Say it aloud. Did you get that buzzing in your ears? Is it voiceless or voiced? Voiced, okay, and you can tell that by that buzzing, or you can feel it here. Could we make the same sound voiceless? What would happen if we did everything as for but had the vocal folds in their open configuration instead of vibrating? Well, try it. Switch it off, just as you can go. You can go. The result is breathing out through your nose, isn't it? See if you can alternate M with breathing out through your nose, which is okay. Now, if we had any speakers of Burmese here, which we don't, they would be able to demonstrate a language in which is used as a speech sound in the language. And in Burmese, there are syllables like me, different from me, but that doesn't apply to any of us, I think. This gives us a way in to seeing how valuable phonetic analysis and description is in understanding all the range of possible sounds in the languages of the world, and how we can analyze them by extending the kind of analysis that we need for English or for our own language. Because we all need to know about voiceless and voiced, we all need to know about nasals, but it so happens that in most languages it's not necessary to speak of voiceless nasals. But there are languages that have them, and you might come across some dialect, or certainly some pathological speech, somebody who has a problem with speaking clearly, a child, for example, perhaps for anatomical reasons, people who have a cleft palate. Supposing a child has got a cleft palate, can't actually prevent sounds being nasal. He wanted to say a word like paper, he'd probably say Mayfan, 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 Mayfan. See if you can say Mayfan, 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 like that. Mayfan. Well, now, with your knowledge of phonetics, you can start to analyse what's involved. You can say, ah, that's a voiceless nasal, instead of the voiceless plosive that is usual in a word like paper. Right, back to English. Point 3 on the handout. We can classify the phonemes of English in terms of voicing. We divide them then into two groups. First of all, the voiceless group, which you can see there, ha, ta, ka, fa, fa, sa, sha, cha, and also h, ha. All of these are, shall we say, normally voiceless. They have the vocal folds in the open position. And they're distinguished from all the rest, for which there may well be voicing. The voiced group, which are ba, da, ga, va, va, za, ja, ja, ma, na, na, ra, la, wa, ya. And all the vowels and diphthongs. And this gives us our basic two-way classification into voiceless sounds and voiced sounds. It's a very basic classification, and I hope that either you understand it already, or if not, that you quickly will, because it's really basic to phonetic description and to our ability to make distinctions like the difference between a pin and a bin and so on. A little bit more about phonetic classification in point 4 on the handout. We can classify speech sounds, classify English phonemes anyhow, by their manner of articulation, what kind of an obstruction there is in the mouth and so on. Is the airflow able to be smooth, or is it made turbulent? So we have then two groups, the sonorant group, in which the airflow is smooth, no serious obstruction to the airflow, versus the obstruents, where there is a serious obstruction. Sonorants then are the nasals, ma, 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 na, 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 na. Liquids, r, 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 la, 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 la. Semivowels and H. H is just different, aspirate. Semivowels, yeah, yeah, were, and the vowels and different. Let's set that group aside. I want to concentrate on the obstruents, which are the ones that do offer some significant obstruction to the flow of air. Three classes within the obstruents: the plosives, the fricatives, and the affricates. We'll be having a separate lecture about these later on, but notice that the plosives involve a complete obstruction to the flow of air. The air is entirely blocked for a moment. A-ba-ba-ba, a-pa-pa-pa, a-da-da, a-ta-ta, a-ka-ka, a-ga-ga, whatever it might be. They're different then from fricatives, because in fricatives the air flows continuously through a narrowing. You can prolong it. The affricates, ch, j, are really like a plosive start and a fricative end. The air is completely blocked for a moment, but then released into a way that allows the air to pass, but with turbulence, giving you friction. Now, the important point about obstruents and voicing is that the obstruents form pairs in English, so that for each voiceless one we have another voiced one. This isn't the case in all languages, but it is rather strikingly so in English. So we have pairs can see that for each one we have another, so that we have phonemic differences within each of these pairs. And this distinction is phonemic, as we say, that is to say it's exploited linguistically. It gives rise to minimum pairs of words where this is the only difference in pronunciation. So we have pairs like pin and bin. Who can give me a minimal pair for t and d?
Tin and din.
Tin and din, okay, yes. And k and g. There are lots of lists of these in your course material. Sorry?
Coat and goat.
Coat and goat, right, coat and goat. F and v, you've got one on the handout. They don't have to be at the beginning of a word. Leave, leave. S and z, you've got one on the handout. In the middle of a word, faces, phases. Sh and j. Who can give me a minimal pair for sh and j? Was that shorge? I don't know word shorge. If we have shore, there's no word jour. That won't go. This is actually not nearly so easy. There's a reason why you might find it difficult to think of minimal pairs for sh and j. Namely that there aren't any. Well, if we really dredge through the dictionary, we might come up with something. I'm sure Jack can tell us one. Well, all that I have in my cache memory ready to produce to you is Aleutian, islands off the coast of Alaska, and allusion, when you allude to something, or Confucian, to do with the Chinese philosopher, versus confusion. But those, I say, are really things that you have to trawl through the dictionary to find. There are, in practical terms, no minimal pairs for sh and j. Nevertheless, it's an important distinction which you must be on top of, because otherwise you're going to have problems with words like pleasure. Because notice that pleasure does not rhyme with pressure. They're not a minimal pair because there's also the RL difference. But it would sound very strange, at least it would sound extremely provincial, shall we say, if you were to say pleasure instead of pleasure. I suppose it would be understood, but even so it would be strange. And certainly you can't say pressure instead of pressure. Pressure, pleasure. Well, linguists formulate this by saying that the functional load of the sh-j opposition is very much lower than the functional load of S-led or TD or the other ones we've looked at. So they are in contrast, but it's not so important. The practical thing for the language learner is that it's not nearly so important to worry about that as it is to worry about important distinctions like s, which, as we know, gives a problem to speakers of Spanish and some other languages, Scandinavians very often. Right, the story so far has been the simple version. And you must all have the simple version thoroughly understood before we move on to the complex version, which is the actual facts, which is what now follows. The problem is, 6 on the handout, that the effects of the phonetic environment mean that the actual phonetic description of voicing may differ from the default or phonological classification. I've used the term default here, which I find myself doing increasingly. This is a term from computer language. If you know anything about computers, you will know that if you have a variable, it can adopt a default value, which means the value that it has unless there's some reason to be something else. The manufacturers of your computer give it various things that can be changed, but they set them in one position, which is what they will be in unless you change them. That position is the default position. You can change it if necessary, but if not necessary, it takes the default position. Well, similarly in phonetics, it seems to be helpful to talk about phonemes having a default value, which is what they are unless there's some reason to be something different. And what I want to look at now is the reasons that sometimes apply the sounds to be different from the default pattern. Well, this does apply particularly to voicing, and this is one of the reasons that people often use the terms fortis rather than voiceless and lenis rather than voiced to refer to the basic classification that we've looked at so far. So we speak of the fortis series politica and the lenis series politica because it's not actually true to say that the lenis ones are always voiced in the literal sense of having the vowels vibrating. Point 7 on the handout. Lenis obstruents. That's the ones I bring. The lenis obstruents are usually devoiced when not surrounded by voiced sounds. So if we take the word dog, you might think, well, that begins with a voiced consonant, D, and ends with a voiced consonant, the G sound. And it's quite true that if we put it in the sentence, my dog loves being taken for a walk, my dog loves, everything is voiced. My dog loves. The D is voiced, the G is voiced, because I've arranged for it to be surrounded by other voiced sounds. I, the vowel, is voiced. L, la, that's all voiced. So this is surrounded by voiced sounds, and there, if we map the activity of the vocal folds, they vibrate all the way through my dog loves. However, the second example, this dog keeps barking. This dog keeps, this dog keeps. What we get here is voicelessness for the S, which spills over into part of the D, so the D is not really fully voiced. We're going to have a voiceless k here, and the voicing switches off early. Voicelessness is contagious in English. Given any chance at all, a voiced obstruent, a lenis obstruent, gives up and doesn't bother to be voiced. In other words, this dog keeps barking, this dog keeps, we don't normally say this dog keeps, but this dog keeps this devoicing effect. And in particular, we don't say this dog. In some languages, voicing is the thing that is contagious, and you get the S getting voiced because of the D, as it were, this dog. Not in English, you can't say this dog, but this dog. It's the voicelessness of this phrase. Third example, one dog stopped, one dog there, the D is voiced because it's between voice sounds, but the G gets devoiced because it's followed by S. One dog stopped. Fourth example, if dogs bark, well, if dogs bark, the D gets devoiced, it's the F, which is voiceless, if dog, but the G, as it's voicing, probably because it's got a B followed. Now lastly, what happens if we say the word in isolation? If we say the word dog in isolation, what's the English meaning of the French word chien? Dog. Dog. Do we get full voicing on the D and G there? Well, not usually. Dog. Dog. I can do it if I'm making a special effort to speak very clearly and unambiguously. I could say it, dog. Dog. But it's not ordinary speech style. I've just been spending hours and hours and hours in the recording studio. We're recording a spoken version of my long pronunciation dictionary, and some of the words I spoke myself and others were done by actors and so on. We had a problem with some of the actors because they put on a special careful form of speech for recording words from the dictionary, and they would say things like dog, and we had to stop them. We said, don't do that, that's not a good model for foreign learners. And we had to encourage them to speak naturally and say dog. Now, you see, for a stage, if you were acting on the stage and you had to project your voice so that everybody could hear, then indeed it might be sensible to say dog. But not in the ordinary conversational style, which is what we base our teaching of English phonetics on. Okay, conversational style involves this linis devoicing. I've used the notational convention here that many of you will already be familiar with, that we can either use these diagonal slashes to mean phonemes, or the square brackets to refer to allophones, allophones being the particular versions, the particular realizations that phonemes adopt in particular positions. Now, what I've said so far then applies to linis obstruens. I suppose it's most striking if we take a word that has linis affricates. The word judge, for example, in English, begins and ends with a linis affricate judge. A voiced affricate? Well, yes, but we don't normally say judge. Not unless it's surrounded by voiced sounds. A judge is someone who passes judgment. Yes, fine, a judge is. But if you say it in isolation, it's normally judge. Judge. Listen very carefully as I slow it down a bit artificially. Judge. Judge. You can hear how the last part is not actually voiced. Notice another thing about it. Let's compare it with the word touch. Again, said in isolation rather slowly and carefully. Touch. 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 Listen to the last bit. We've already noticed it's voiceless. Touch. Compare judge. The first one ends in ch, ch, ch. The second one ends in ch, ch, ch. Touch. Judge. Can you hear the difference? It's rather subtle, but believe me, it is there. D-voiced j is not quite the same as proper voiceless ch. Why not? Oh, well, one hypothesis is that this involves the vocal folds being open, whereas this involves the vocal folds being narrowed. What we do basically is whisper devoiced obstruents. This accounts for the fact that the airflow is observably lower, smaller, through the mouth. And that's why it's not so noisy. Ch is noisy, it's fortis, vocal folds are open, lots of air coming. Devoiced is not so noisy, some kind of obstruction at the vocal folds, so the airflow is reduced, and the consequence is there's not so much noise. This, anyhow, is what people are getting at by using the terms fortis versus linis. Fortis, the Latin for strong, linis, the Latin for smooth or weak. Right, that applies to the obstruents. It doesn't apply to the sonorants. Point 8 on the handout. So if we take a word like lamb, the L and the M are fully voiced. Lamb. Whatever environment it's in. This lamb keeps bleating. This lamb keeps. You don't say this lamb keeps. We don't in isolation say lamb. No, we say lamb. And you do get that voicing all the way through. So what I've been saying applies to the obstruents, but not to these sonorants. This lamb seems to be lost. Or not in any serious way, shall we say. Let's move on to the last important point of today's lecture, which concerns aspiration. Aspiration. Point 9. When the fortis plosives pataca are at the beginning of a stressed syllable, and more generally we can say when they're at the beginning of a syllable with a strong vowel, then they are aspirated. Pa, ta, ka. You can think of aspiration as being followed by a brief H sound, a brief puff of air. Pa, ta, ka. If we take the word pin, the point is that in English we don't say pin, we say pin. I can now demonstrate this using my visual aid. Pin, pin. We don't in English say bin, bin. We say pin. Let us compare Spanish and English. If we take the Spanish word for but, which is pero, and compare that with an English mispronunciation of that same word, which is pero. Do you notice the difference? In English, PTK are aspirated. In Spanish, they're not. In Japanese, they are a bit, so let's not talk about Japanese. In general, speakers of Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and of Dutch have problems in English because of aspiration, because you basically have to learn to aspirate. Also speakers of Greek and some other languages. Whereas speakers of Germanic languages don't have any problems. Speakers of Chinese tend to overdo aspiration. What we have to do, therefore, is look at the facts and see how they are, and you can see how it might or might not apply to you yourself. In English, it's P, T, and K that get aspirated. So P in pin, K in come, T in words like top. And it applies not just exactly at the beginning of a word, but at the beginning of a syllable that has a strong vowel because it's stressed or for some other reason. So in the word attack, or the word appear, you get aspiration. Right, this P is not at the beginning of a word, but it is at the beginning of this stressed syllable. So you get aspiration. Appear. It appears, it appears. Not it appears, but it appears. You get aspiration because it's at the beginning of the syllable. Likewise in attack. Attack. Just as in time, or top, or tear. As in come, so also in occur, meaning to happen. Now, I've been cheating just a little bit with this visual aid. I've been demonstrating only with P sounds, have you noticed? Because if you try and do it with K, it really is not nearly so dramatic. Come. Well, a bit. Come. Come. But it's not so good as with pay. There are books on pedagogy, on teaching pronunciation in the classroom that tell you to demonstrate this with a match with a flame on it, or with a feather on a book. I think the people who wrote those books have no practical experience of teaching in a classroom. Whereas a piece of paper is, you can keep it under control. Practice it beforehand, because it does depend also on whether the paper is suitably flexible or this and that. So don't do it without trying it first. Basically, this aspiration is a matter of timing of the vibration of the vocal folds. If we have to go from a voiceless configuration to a voiced configuration, we've got to change. So in a word like pin, or our vocal folds are apart for the p, no vibration. We're going to be vibrating for the I and also for the N, pin. The question is, where does the change happen? Well now, if we put the boundary between the two sounds as when the lips come apart, the point is that the boundary of the lips moving is earlier than the point at which the vocal folds catch up. So again, we can see this as being voicelessness that is contagious, that spreads into the adjacent segment. And rather than start vibrating immediately, pin, pa, 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 as happens in French or Spanish, we get pin, pa, 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 pa in English with this delay. Now, supposing this delay is occupied by a sonorant. Supposing we've got the word play. Well, in fact, I've not done it very accurately because we find that the L, the sonorant, usually occupies the whole of the space of the delay. And in a word like play, the result is usually that the L sound is voiceless. Play, 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 play. And not play, 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 but play, play. It's an automatic effect if you aspirate the P and the immediately following sound is not the vowel, but an L or an R or a W or a yod. Similarly, the W in twin, 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 because it's like tin, twin. And the third example on the handout, the word across. The R there is usually voiceless, across, because it carries the voicelessness. Okay. All right, aspiration, but not in all positions. Point 10, there's no aspiration at BTK. First of all, after S in the same syllable. So in the word spin, notice that you don't get aspiration. Spin. We say spin, spell, stop, scan, restore, and not spin, restore, scan. Those are Chinese mispronunciations, because Chinese people aspirate BTK typically in all positions, but it's not appropriate to do it after S. So play sports and non-sports. Second point, no aspiration before a fricative. So the plural of lip is lips. Lips. We don't say lips. Depth. Same point there. That's, I think, pretty obvious. Third point, we don't normally aspirate before another plosive. In a word like doctor, the K there, doctor, you can hardly hear it. We shall look at that in greater detail later on. It's typically masked, in fact, by the articulation of the T. Similarly, the P sound in opt has no aspiration. In the phrase that kind, there are actually three rival possibilities which I offer for the experts among you. You can have a T with no audible release, that kind. You can have a glottal stop, that kind. Or you can have a geminated velar, that kind. But in each case, we don't hear aspiration. Only in very careful speech, that kind, would you get it. All right, we've seen positions, first of all, where PTK are aspirated. Secondly, where they're unaspirated. Now, there's also an intermediate set of positions, 11 on the handout, where you get what's commonly described as unaspirated, but in fact may have a little bit of aspiration. And this is like the K sound, for example, in lucky. Lucky, now it's not lucky, absolute zero aspiration, nor is it lucky, full aspiration, but it's a bit of aspiration. Lucky, 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 lucky. Similarly, at the end of a word, like lake, right. And even after an S at the end of a word, wasp. Rest. This is important when you have a following vowel. For example, I don't like it. You don't have to aspirate that K. Don't say I don't like it. I don't like it. That doesn't sound right. Little aspiration or none, I don't like it. Like it, like it. Now, there are some languages that have paired phonemes aspirated and unaspirated, in particular languages of the Indian subcontinent, so that you get contrasts of pa versus ba versus ba versus ba. This means that Indians are very highly alert to aspiration. They tend not to aspirate in English at all, which is part of what we hear as an Indian accent. So if you want to change that, you must put in some aspiration. So take becomes take, bin becomes pin, gun becomes come. Getting aspiration wrong on the whole won't lead to misunderstanding, though sometimes it can, but it will help to make you sound foreign. If you want to sound more like native English speakers, you must be in charge of aspiration and study carefully what you have to do. Right, that's it for this one.